Hi everyone. So now we're going to be talking about distance and midpoint formula. We're done with the naming of angles and everything, and we're kind of moving on to something that's different, but this is also pretty easy. So on this self-check, we're going to be asking to find the distance between the two different points and the midpoint between two different points. So let's just talk about what those two things mean. The midpoint means it's right in the middle of the 2 points. So if I drew a line from point A to point B, that midpoint would be right in the middle of the two. And then the distance is the actual length between point A and point B. You're going to only have to find one or the other for each of these questions, so you definitely don't have to do both of them for each question. We're going to start with the midpoint, and you have a cheat sheet with these formulas on there as well, but the midpoint formula is the mid is equal to x1 plus x2 divided by 2, comma, y1 plus y2 divided by 2. Now, it looks kind of funny with a comma in between, but basically this is just this is a way to make the equation smaller. We don't have to write two different equations. What we're going to end up doing is doing the x portion, or the portion I just wrote the arrow to, in the calculator, or doing that separately, getting an answer, and then we're going to do the y portion and get an answer for that portion. And our answer will actually be a point. Our answer will say like some number, comma, some number. That's the way that our answers will look for the midpoint. So let's get started with the first example. The first thing that we need to do is label our points. So we have, for the first example, we want to find the midpoint between 6, 10 and 8, 20. In order to do that, what we're going to do is first label our points. Now, just because the 6, 10 came first, that's my point 1. And so I'm going to say that 6 is x1 and 10 is y1. X always comes first in my point, so it'll always be x then y. So x1 and y1. And then because 8, 20 came second, we're going to label that our second point. We can say x, 2, y, 2. It wouldn't really matter. I could have switched that up, but this is the way that I recommend doing it, just so you don't confuse yourself. Now that we know what x1, y1, x2, y2 are, what we're going to do is plug them into the formula. So I'm going to have midpoint is equal to x1 plus x2, which would be 6 plus 8, because those are our x's, divided by 2, then comma, and then we have y1 plus y2 divided by 2, which would give us 10 plus 20 divided by 2. So like I said, we're going to simplify them separately. I'm going to start by simplifying the first part, which is 6 plus 8 divided by 2. So 6 plus 8 is 14. So I have 14 divided by 2, which actually gives me 7. And then on the second part, we have 10 plus 20 divided by 2. And 10 plus 20 is 30. And then 30 divided by 2 is 15. And so my final answer for the midpoint is 7, 15. That's right in the middle of my two original points. All right, now let's go to the second example. The second example, same thing. We're going to say that the midpoint is equal, or actually I lied. Let's start by labeling our points. So again, we're going to say this is x and this is y, because x always comes first, but because it's a first point, it's x1, y1. And then for the second point, we would have x, y, but they're both x2 and y2. So now when we plug them into that formula, we have the midpoint is equal to, in the first space, we have x1 plus x2, which in this case will give us -5 plus 2 divided by 2. And then the y portion will be 8 plus -7 divided by 2. Now, I didn't write them in parentheses, but sometimes it's helpful to put the negative numbers in parentheses just so we don't get confused with the plus signs that are in the equation and then the minus signs that are not part of the numbers. Either way, it's up to you. Just make sure that you know what you're doing and that you consistently do it. So now we're going to do the x's. We have -5 plus 2, which gives me a -3. And -3 divided by 2 gives me a -1.5. So you are definitely okay to get decimals or leave them in fraction form. If I left that in fraction form, it'd be -3/2. And then for the right-hand side, we have 8 plus -7, which is the same thing as saying 8 minus 7, and 8 minus 7 is 1, and 1 divided by 2 is 1/2. So I can write it as 1/2, or I can write it as 0.5. Either way, the midpoint is -1.5, 0.5. All right, so that's how we deal with the midpoint. Now let's talk about the distance. And the distance formula is now right at the top of my screen. It's d is equal to the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. So it's just a different formula, but you still set it up the same way in that we want to label our x's and y's first, and then we just plug them straight into the formula. So we know this is x1, this is y1, then we have x2 and y2. So when we plug them into the formula, we have distance is equal to the square root of, you have to start with the second one this time. So x2 is 1 minus x1, which is 5 squared, plus y2, which is 4, minus y1, which is 5 squared, and that's all square rooted. All right, so potentially we could plug this entire thing into a calculator, but I'm going to have you try and at least simplify a little bit by hand, because I want your answers to stay in radical form or in simplified radical form. So when I simplify this, I'm still going to use the square root for a second. We have 1 minus 5 squared. So 1 minus 5 is a negative 4, which means I have this negative 4 squared plus 4 minus 5 gives me a negative 1, so it'll be negative 1 squared. Notice that I use those parentheses still because it's everything's squared. And when we square negative numbers, it actually becomes positive. So you want to make sure that you remember that, or at least you keep them in parentheses so that your calculator can do that. So then we have 4 squared, which is 16. Negative 4 squared, which is also positive 16. And then plus negative 1 squared, which is 1. All right. And then we can just add those two things together. 16 plus 1 is 17. So my distance is equal to the square root of 17. I can't simplify the square root of 17. So my final answer is distance is equal to the square root of 17. All right. Now let's go through this last example. Once again, we're going to label our x's and y's. So this is x1, y1, x2, y2. And then for our distance formula, we're going to have the square root. We start with x2 first. So x2 is 3 minus x1, which is negative 8. So I'm going to put that negative 8 in it's its own set of parentheses just so I don't get confused that the minus sign from the equation and the negative sign from the 8. And then plus y2, which is negative 5. Again, putting it in its own set of parentheses. Minus y1, which is negative 7. Again, own set of parentheses squared. Then we're going to square root the whole thing. Now we're going to simplify that. So in the front, we have 3 minus negative 8. When you have two negatives right next to each other, it makes a big positive. So this is another way of saying 3 plus 8 squared. And we know 3 plus 8 is 11. So I'm going to say 11 squared plus, then on the right-hand side, we have negative 5 minus a negative 7. So these two negatives right here make a big positive, which means now I have negative 5 plus 7, which gives me a 2 squared. All right, now we can square these numbers. 11 squared is 121, and 2 squared is 4. So now we have the square root of 121 plus 4, which is the square root of 125, because I can add those things together. Now that is my answer, but I can simplify that square root a little bit. If you remember, we did this a couple of lessons ago. We're going to split it up by using a factor tree. So any two numbers that multiply to be 125, I know that is 25 times 5. Then I'm going to split up the 25 because 25 I know is 5 times 5. Excuse me. And that's it because I can't split the 5s up. Once I have this pair, once I have it all split up, I can circle pairs. So I have a pair of 5s right there. When I have a pair, it pulls out of the square root. So my final answer ends up being 5 from that circled pair, square root 5 from the 5, this 5 that I didn't circle. And that is my distance. And there we have it. That is how we find the midpoint and distance.